When countries establish colonies, they are usually reluctant to give them up. And when countries do give up colonies, it typically happens because of outside pressure, unrest within the colony, or demands from their own population at home. However, none of these factors were really present when Liberia declared its independence from the United States in 1847. And what's even more surprising is that the US government did basically nothing to stop them. So why is that? Why did the United States let go of Liberia so easily? To answer this, we must first examine how Liberia was established. Beginning in the early 1800s, a movement emerged in the US advocating for the resettlement of freed slaves and their descendants to Africa. This idea was popular among Christian activists who believed that discrimination against black people in America could not be overcome, even in those states that had already abolished slavery. As such, to them, Africa appeared as the only place where African Americans could live free from racism and discrimination. This idea was also popular with slaveholders, who feared that freed slaves would help stage slave revolts, potentially leading to a racial civil war. In 1816, supporters of the resettlement plan founded the American Colonization Society, which soon acquired land on the western coast of Africa and started sending its first black settlers there. It had also secured backing from the United States government. From the outset, there was an understanding that Liberia would eventually gain independence. The American public held a firm belief that the United States is distinct from the European colonial powers in that it would expand not by colonizing land, but by exporting its liberal democratic ideals to less civilized parts of the globe, in the same manner that they had been doing in North America. As such, the American perspective was that they were not colonizing Africa, but rather creating a free nation for Africans on African soil. Or at least, that was the official rhetoric. In practice, Liberia mostly functioned just like any European colony, with the power concentrated in the hands of the white employees of the American Colonization Society. This left the black settlers with very little say in Liberia. However, things would eventually change because of the British Empire. You see, one of Liberia's main sources of income was the collection of fees on the trade between European powers and the African interior, which passed through Liberia's soil and territorial waters. The United Kingdom chose to ignore Liberian trade regulations since Liberia was not able to enforce these regulations and was also not a sovereign nation. This sparked discussions within the American Colonization Society about declaring independence. This discussion was picked up by the black elite of the colony, although they began to view independence favorably for a different reason. They argued that Liberia could have immense symbolic meaning in proving that black people were capable of running a modern state. With that, some believed Liberia would follow in America's footsteps and expand across Africa. Over time, the idea of an independence began spreading among the black settlers, and unrest was slowly brewing. The American Colonization Society knew that if they didn't provide the black settlers the self-governance that they had been promised, the colony would revolt sooner or later. The ACS also knew that they lacked the resources to suppress a rebellion and could only successfully keep Liberia under their control with the help from the US government. Unfortunately for the colonists, the US government was not willing to provide that help. So why not? Well, simply put, it had no interest in doing so. Economically speaking, the colony had never been profitable, and even if Britain did start respecting the fees that Liberia imposed, the prospects of economic growth in Liberia were rather grim. And internally, there would have been little support among the American public if the US Army went off to Liberia to suppress a revolt. The American Colonization Society had successfully framed Liberia as a second United States in Africa, and fighting the settlers to keep the colony under its control would have been highly unpopular among the Americans. Similarly, it would have been a disaster for America's standing among the other nations, as Liberia's War of Independence would have had many parallels to the American one and would undermine the United States' ideological foundation. As such, faced with no choice, the ACS tasked a group of prominent black settlers with drafting a constitution for Liberia, and on July 26, 1847, Liberia became independent. Thank you for watching, and a big thank you to my supporter on Patreon, Rostislav, 1917.